So welcome everyone to the Cash for College Advanced FAFSA webinar. This session is going to build upon our FAFSA 101 webinar to address some of the more complex parts of the financial aid application. If we haven't met yet, my name is May Whiting, and I am the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. We'd like to take a quick moment to recognize our sponsors for supporting this work and making these training opportunities possible. We'd also like to take a moment to recognize our partners who are very active in this work. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times just to avoid any feedback during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Alabama Possible. And then throughout the webinar, you can submit questions using the Zoom chat feature. When typing in the Zoom chat, please make sure to select everyone so that all of the participants are able to see your question or comment in the chat. That way we can just reduce the number of duplicate questions that were asked. And so we'll be collecting these questions throughout the webinar, and then we'll attempt to answer them all towards the end during our Q&A session. If there's anything that we don't answer during the webinar, we will definitely make sure to answer it in the follow-up email that goes out to all of you. We will have poll questions throughout the webinar. These are designed to get real-time feedback, so we would love it if everyone could participate in those questions. And then if you are a high school educator looking to get professional development credit, then you will need to complete those poll questions in order to receive your credit. So please stay all the way to the end of the webinar, where we'll have our required poll questions for PD. This webinar could be as long as 1.5 hours, so just keep that in mind. I'll try to be as efficient as possible though. If you are on social media, please feel free to tag us at AL Goes to College so that we can see and celebrate your work. We always encourage the use of the following hashtags if you're posting any financial aid related content. So hashtag Pell Yes, hashtag FAFSA, hashtag Cash for College. Just a quick reminder that high schools can still sign up for the Alabama Goes to College campaign. You can do that at the link seen on the screen. If you register past our October 1st deadline, you unfortunately will not be eligible for our end of year monetary awards, but you can still receive all of the supports of the campaign, including trainings like these. So these are each of our campaign components. So there are 3 different initiatives. Our campaign as a whole aims for every student in our state to have the opportunity to plan for, pursue, and complete valuable post-secondary credentials. So the component we're focusing on today is our Cash for College component, which builds awareness around financial aid for post-secondary ed. And our goal is for every graduating senior to complete their free application for federal student aid before they graduate from high school. So that will allow them to access federal, state, and institutional aid. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to describe student eligibility for federal financial aid. We'll also investigate complicated dependency circumstances. We'll determine parental information that you have to report, especially in complex living situations. We'll also explore some special circumstances you might encounter. We're going to spend some time differentiating between submission and completion as it relates to the FAFSA, and hopefully that will help you as you're tracking and monitoring your school's progress. And then we'll review a few FAFSA completion resources. So remember, we're always happy to answer your questions, so please feel free to drop those in the chat. We're going to start off with a quick poll question. Just want to see if folks in attendance today were able to attend our FAFSA 101 webinar. If you didn't have a chance to attend live, we do have that recording up on our YouTube channel. Again, that's youtube.com/Alabama Possible. So yes, Steph, that is available on our channel now. You can access it already. I wanted, before we dive into the content, wanted to give a quick update on FAFSA completion progress for the class of 2023. So these charts provide data through the month of October. As you can see on the left side of the screen, Alabama is that orange bar, and then the nation is that blue bar. And so while Alabama's year-over-year improvement has dropped week after week, we still have a positive increase of 10.5%, which is greater than the national year-over-year change of 8.7%. So we are doing better than the national rate. And then you see on the right, this is the percent of seniors who've completed a FAFSA. And you can see that 14.1% of Alabama's class of 2023 has completed a FAFSA, which is just slightly behind the national rate of 14.7%. So we have, 14.1% there. And then just to show you a few stats for different populations, in the first month of the FAFSA cycle, we're seeing really great strides for low-income schools, schools with high concentrations of students of color, and then we're also seeing great progress in schools that are in cities and in rural areas. So again, this is data through the month of October, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that. So getting into today's material, let's just start with a quick review. Many of you know the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It gives students access to the largest source of financial aid for certificates or degrees, whether that's at 2-year or 4-year programs. And the application is used to determine a student's eligibility for grants, scholarships, work-study jobs, and loans. So we want to talk about eligibility requirements for federal aid. So who is eligible for federal aid? To be fully eligible to accept federal aid, students must be a US citizen, a US national, or eligible non-citizen, which we'll talk a lot more about that eligible non-citizen category. They have to have a valid Social Security number, with the exception of students from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. And then they have to have a high school diploma or a GED certificate, or they must have completed a high school education in a homeschool setting that is approved under state law, or be enrolled in an eligible career pathway program and meet one of the ability to benefit alternatives. Other eligibility requirements: they must also be enrolled and accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. They will then, once they're actually in that program, have to maintain satisfactory academic progress. So that is going to be defined by the institution they're attending. So they'll need to keep track of what that means for them at their particular school. And then lastly, they'll have to sign certifying statements. These are mostly applicable to current college students who have already been receiving federal aid. So these are statements like, I'm not in default on federal student loans, I don't owe money on a federal student grant, And then for everyone, that they're going to use federal student aid only for educational purposes. So those are the eligibility requirements for students, and we're going to get into more of the details of those. But once you determine whether a student is eligible, the next step is really figuring out who is going to need an FSA ID. And the FSA ID is a username and password that allows students and parents to access federal student aid web pages. And this will also serve as an electronic signature when submitting the FAFSA form. A student will need to create an FSA ID by listing their full name and their social security number exactly as it is seen on their social security card. So they're going to need to reference that card while they're creating their FSA ID. And as they create it, they'll have an opportunity to include their phone number and their email address. And it's really important that students use a personal email address and not a school email or a work email that is subject to change. It's also really important that students have their own personal email address that is completely separate from their parents. So I wanted to point out a newer option that you may or may not have noticed, but when a student goes to start their FAFSA, they can log in with the FSA ID they've already created, or if they haven't yet created one, they can go ahead and do that process. But a little bit newer to this is the use of personal identifiers to access the FAFSA form. And we highly recommend that students not start their FAFSA by inputting personal identifiers. So there's a few reasons why we don't recommend this. When students do this option, what we saw for the few students who did this last year is that when they started using personal identifiers, they thought they had already created their FSA ID, but they actually haven't. So creating the FSA ID is totally separate from just inputting your personal identifiers. Then when the student progresses throughout the application, they get to the end where they need to sign and submit, they actually don't have an FSA ID. They've only started their FAFSA using their personal identifiers. So then they actually have to go through the process of creating an FSA ID. And if they're trying to meet some kind of deadline or submit their FAFSA by a certain date, they could be delayed because they're going to have to go through that creation process. So if your students haven't already, they should go ahead and create their FSA ID before starting the FAFSA. Another part of creating the FSA ID, something that's new this year, is a backup code. So this backup code is a special code. It allows students to access their account if they're unable to use the two-step verification method. So we recommend, and FSA recommends, as you can see on the screen, storing this backup code somewhere safe. What we have done is we've added a line for that on our FSA ID worksheet so that students can have that handy. Now, ideally, students are able to access their account through one of the verification methods. So that might be phone or email address. When students are creating their account, like I said, they can add both a phone and an email address, or they can choose. Like we've seen mentioned in the chat, sometimes students have a problem when their phone number has already been used for a different FSA ID. In that case, for the sense of urgency that the student probably feels, go ahead and just input an email address for the verification method. That way the student is still able to create their FSA ID. And then we have a few different resources for the student to reconcile the fact that their phone number is already being used. So that was mentioned in our newsletter last week, and I'll talk more about it at the end if we have time. So continuing on with who needs an FSA ID. So obviously the student will need to create one before they start their FAFSA. And then their parent should also create one if the student is dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So if that student is dependent and they do need to provide parent information, the parent should create an FSA ID unless the parent does not have a social security number. If the parent doesn't have a social security number, unfortunately, they won't be able to create an FSA ID, but they can still complete the FAFSA. The only difference being instead of signing electronically with their FSA ID, they're going to sign by printing off the signature page, signing, dating, and mailing that in. Um, Again, same guidance for parents. We encourage them to use a personal email address when creating the FSA ID, and the email address should be totally separate from what the student uses for their own account. So make sure there's no crossover between parent and student. Like I mentioned, when parents don't have a social security number, they're not able to create an FSA ID. Because of this, they have to print, sign, and mail the signature page. So here on the screen, you see an example of what a signature page looks like. It will pop up into a separate window, and then you'll have the opportunity to print that. They'll have the opportunity to sign and date, and then you will mail it to the address that is listed exactly on the signature page. Okay, so we're going to go through the actual application section by section to discuss some of the trickier or more confusing aspects of it. So we'll start off with student demographics. And in the student demographics section, one thing that is especially confusing for folks is the question about citizenship. So the student can respond one of three ways to this question. They can say, yes, I'm a US citizen or US national. No, but I am an eligible non-citizen. Or no, I'm not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. So with the three options, depending on which one they select, their process for moving forward will differ. So with option one, if the student is a US citizen or US national, they'll pretty much just proceed forward with the application with no extra requirements. If option two applies and the student is an eligible non-citizen, we'll define this in a little bit later, they're going to need to provide their alien registration number. And then if option three applies, meaning the student is not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, they can proceed forward, but they will have extremely limited aid options. And likely they're going to need to contact the financial aid office of their college after they've submitted. So let's get into this in a little more detail. So with option one, US citizens are persons, except for the children of foreign diplomatic staff, who were born in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and in most cases, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. US citizens also include most persons born abroad to a parent or parents who are citizens. And then for US nationals, these are natives of American Samoa or Swains Island. So that's option one, where you just proceed forward without having to provide any extra information. For option two, if a student is not a US citizen or US national, they might be an eligible non-citizen. So they'll need to provide other documentation to show that they are an eligible non-citizen. So this includes a green card for someone like a permanent resident, an arrival departure record for a refugee, asylee, parolee, a T visa, or a parent who has a T visa. So these are for victims of human trafficking. Proof of battered immigrant status, so victims of abuse. And then citizenship of these different geographies. They can also show status under the Jay Treaty of 1789, and that will apply to certain Native American students born in Canada. So these are folks who are considered eligible non-citizens, so they are indeed eligible for federal aid. They just have to provide extra documentation, and they will also need to provide their alien registration number. So you can see here, if they selected option number 2, they'll type in that alien registration number there. So it's 8 or 9 digit number. Now, option 3. So a student is not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, meaning they're not going to be eligible for federal aid. So this might apply to the following people: those who have been granted deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, a F1 or F2 student visa, a J1 or J2 exchange visitor visa, and a G series visa that pertains to international organizations. So these folks are not going to be eligible for federal aid, but like with the first bullet, some students who have been granted DACA do have a social security number, so they can complete the FAFSA to determine eligibility for state institutional aid where applicable. So yeah, a little more on DACA. Like I mentioned, they're not going to be eligible for federal aid, but these students are, they do have a protected status under this immigration policy. So it allows children who are brought to the country as quite young folks to be able to receive renewable 2-year period of deferred action from deportation. So the current administration is really pushing for federal aid to be expanded and for these students to actually be able to receive federal student aid. That hasn't yet gone through or passed, but should it, we will definitely keep you informed. So we're going to be having an entire webinar on the topic. It will cover how to navigate financial aid for immigrant families. And so we'll talk about this in detail during that. So we're finished with the citizenship question, and we're still in student demographics. So I wanted to point out a few questions that really might trip you up. So they might seem straightforward, but they can lead to some problems for students if they don't answer these questions correctly. So when the FAFSA asks, what college degree or certificate will you be working on when you begin, and it'll actually say the 2023-24 school year for this current FAFSA. It gives a bunch of different options, and students should select the option that best describes their educational goals, but they might not yet be decided between a 2-year program or a 4-year program. And so while they're in that process of deciding, they should choose one of those options as their answer rather than selecting other or undecided, because by selecting that last option, they might have to do more follow-up work with the financial aid office. And what I've heard from some financial aid administrators is that if a student indicates they're intending to go for a bachelor's degree, but then they actually end up starting their associate's degree, if the student selects bachelor's degree, it's not going to cause any issue at the 2-year college where they end up. So just make one of the selections and do not choose the last option. All right. So when it asks what the student's college grade level will be when they begin the 2023-24 school year, if the student is a senior in high school at the moment they're filling out the FAFSA, they're going to say that they never attended college. So they're in their first year, never attended college. And this is the case even if they have taken things like dual enrollment or advanced placement classes. So they might have some college credit already to their name. Even so, they're going to answer this question as never attended first year. Basically, with this question, what the FAFSA is mostly trying to understand is whether the student has received federal aid in the past. So our high school students have not yet had an opportunity to receive aid. So moving on to our school selection. So this is where a student is going to put in their high school information. And they have an opportunity to search for their high school by state, city, and then name of the school. If their high school cannot be found using the search, it is important for students to enter the state, city, and the full name of their high school so that FAFSA completion can still be tracked. So this is the main way that we're all getting information for how many of our students have completed a FAFSA. So this part, while it might not seem important to the student, is really important to you as educators who are supporting the student in FAFSA completion. So we want to make sure that we are selecting the correct high school. Occasionally, a school isn't found. I find that that's pretty rare. But when that happens, you just want to encourage students to put all three fields here, even though city and high school are optional. Moving on to dependency status, where we'll spend quite a lot of time. I want to do a quick poll question just to gauge everyone's understanding. So I've launched that now. So the question, if a student is claimed as a dependent on taxes, that student is automatically a dependent on the FAFSA. True or false? All right, we have close to 70% of folks who have answered. If you answered true, don't feel bad. This is an extremely common misconception, and we're displaying it right here in our poll. We had about 54% of folks say true, but tax dependency has absolutely nothing to do with FAFSA dependency. So when we're thinking about FAFSA dependency, we're never asking ourselves, was this student claimed as a dependent on taxes? Completely irrelevant question. So we'll talk a little bit more about dependency today, and we'll find a few different resources that we should always be consulting whenever we're trying to figure out dependency. But something that we're not consulting are federal income taxes. That just doesn't play a factor at all. So thank you for answering that. Okay, so let's talk more about dependency status. So the actual application is going to walk the student through a series of questions to determine whether the student is dependent or independent. And it will skip questions that aren't relevant to the student. The FAFSA does that a lot, actually. It has built-in skip logic. Now, independent students, as you know, do not require any parent information on the FAFSA. However, they may require additional documentation just to verify their independent status, because being independent on the FAFSA is less common than being dependent. And then dependent students will have to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So if you would like to review all of the dependency questions at once to determine whether or not a student should report parent information, then you can find this printable questionnaire in our educators toolkit. We have both English and Spanish available, although I have noticed they did not update the Spanish version for the 2023-24 school year. So we're still waiting on that, but we do have the previous years available in our toolkit. However, the actual FAFSA web pages that show you these dependency questions, when you go to the web page, so if you go to fafsa.gov, you have an option in the top right corner to click Spanish, and you should be able to see all of those pages in Spanish. So definitely recommend that if you serve a population with many Spanish speakers. So these are all of our questions. We really recommend using this as a screening tool before students even start the FAFSA. to figure out what kind of documentation they're going to need while they're working on their application. So we really see this as like a precursor to even starting the FAFSA. So let's go through each of the questions now. So first it's going to ask, were you born before January 1st, 2000? And then as of today, are you married? Also answer yes if you are separated but not divorced. At the beginning of the 2023-24 school year, will you be working on a master's degree or doctorate degree? And then it gives you some examples. Do you have or will you have children who receive more than half of their support from you between July 1st, 2023 and June 30th, 2024? Other than children, do you have dependents? So again, other than children or a spouse, do you have dependents who live with you and who receive more than half of their support from you now and through June 30th, 2024? Are you currently serving on active duty in the US Armed Forces for purposes other than training? Are you a veteran of the US Armed Forces? At any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased? Were you in foster care? Or were you a dependent or ward of the court? Has it been decided by a court in your state of legal residence that you are an emancipated minor or that someone other than your parent or step parent has legal guardianship of you? You should also answer yes if you are now an adult but were in legal guardianship or were an emancipated minor immediately before you reached the age of being an adult in your state. And then a very important note of clarification here, you will answer no to this question if your court papers say custody rather than guardianship. So difference between legal custody and legal guardianship. It's legal guardianship that will make a student independent. And then the very last question, at any time on or after July 1st, 2022, were you determined to be an unaccompanied youth who was homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And this can be determined by your high school or district homeless liaison, the director of an emergency shelter or transitional housing program, or the director of a runaway or homeless youth basic center or transitional living program. So these are all the questions in one. So again, highly recommend using it as a screening tool. If a student answers yes to any of the questions, so even just one question, they're considered independent, meaning they do not have to provide parent info. If the student answers no to all of the questions, they are dependent and will need to provide parent info. So again, that questionnaire has all the questions in one place, but the way that you actually see this on the FAFSA, you see it broken up into several different pages. So right here, you see that it's asking about the student's marital status. Right here, you see it's asking if the student has any children or any other kind of dependents, so someone that they're providing for financially. And then you see these additional dependency questions. And I want to revisit two of these and just add a few notes. So here, when the FAFSA is asking whether someone other than a parent or step parent has legal guardianship of you, again, this is different from legal custody. So that court documentation must say legal guardianship. And then if the student answers yes to that, they are considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So if they're independent, they do not have to provide parent information. The other one that I want to single out is the question about homelessness. So the FAFSA asks, on or after July 1st, 2022, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? Now, if the student answers yes to this question, the application is actually going to bring you to a more detailed question. So it's going to ask now, at any time on or after July 1st, 2022, Did you receive a determination from any of the entities listed below that you are an unaccompanied youth who is homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So now it's asking, were you both unaccompanied and homeless? And we'll define those terms on our next slide. But if the student is saying yes, they're going to need to provide a determination from one of these entities listed here. Okay, so here are some definitions for that specific question. So homeless is going to mean lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. You may be homeless if you're living in shelters, parks, motels, hotels, public spaces, camping grounds, cars, abandoned buildings, or you're temporarily living with other people because you have nowhere else to go. Also, if you're living in any of these situations and fleeing an abusive parent, you may be considered homeless, even if your parent would otherwise provide a place to live. And then on top of that, we're checking to see if the student is unaccompanied. And that means that the student is not living in the physical custody of their parent or guardian. So the FAFSA will ask if both of these definitions apply, and then if the student has that record of determination from one of the entities listed. And if you are working with homeless youth, there are a few resources we recommend. One is that Schoolhouse Connection resource that we have linked in the slides. So we'll be sure to email that out in the follow-up email so that you can access it. So we've gone through student demographics, dependency status, and now we're moving on to the parent demographics. So this will only apply if the student is indeed a dependent for the purposes of FAFSA. So you'll see that the actual application is going to provide a few different scenarios and then guide students on how to proceed based on the scenario that applies to them. But another way of determining who is my parent on the FAFSA is to use our flow chart. So there's a couple different versions of these. They're just aesthetic differences. They all ask the same questions, but this is the flow chart that we have linked in our educators toolkit. And so it will guide you through questions in sequence to determine whose information to report, because honestly, it is very rarely straightforward whose parent information to provide. So let's read through this one together. So the first question, you're going to start right here. Are your parents married to each other? If yes, report information for both of them on the FAFSA. If no, they're not married to each other, do your parents still live together? If yes, report information for both parents on the FAFSA, even if they were never married, are divorced, or separated. If they don't live together, then it's going to ask, did you live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? If yes, you're going to report the information for the parent you lived with more. And then if that parent has remarried, you're going to report also your step parents' information. But if you ask the question, did you live with one parent more than the other? And the answer is no, I lived with them completely 50-50. It was an even split. In that case, you're going to report information for the parent who provided more financial support. And that's going to be the financial support over the last 12 months or in the last year that the student actually received support. And then once you've determined that parent, you're going to ask, has that parent remarried? And if so, report step parent information. Now, really important right here is that the following people are never the parent unless they've legally adopted the student. So a widowed step parent, grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, older brothers or sisters, aunts or uncles. Never, ever will these people be the parent on the FAFSA unless they've legally adopted the student. So now we've gone through all of those questions, how to determine the parent, but what if a dependent student doesn't live with or have contact with their parents? Well, they can submit the FAFSA without parent information if any of these special circumstances apply. So, one would be their parents are incarcerated, another would be that the student has left home due to an abusive family environment. Another would be they do not know where their parents are and they're unable to contact them, and the student has not been adopted. And then lastly, that they're older than 21 but not yet 24, are unaccompanied, and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So if any of these applies, then the student has special circumstances. And although they were determined to be a dependent, they don't have to provide parent information. But what they want to make sure that they do, since they're not providing parent information, in order for their application to actually be fully processed, they're going to need to do some follow-up. So they'll need to immediately contact the financial aid office of the college they're planning to go to. They'll need to gather documentation of their situation. And only at that point can they receive an EFC or an expected family contribution, and then subsequently a financial aid package based on the determination of the school. And I see the question in the chat. I think we'll have a scenario that will specifically address your question. So this is what a student would do if they're dependent, but they have a special circumstance that meant they didn't have to provide parent information. There are also a few other circumstances, and these are not considered special circumstances, but they are probably something that you might encounter in your time. So for students who have contact with their parents, but their parents refuse to provide info, and we hear this from y'all quite frequently, parents just absolutely refusing to participate. In that case, the student may submit the FAFSA form without parent information. However, it's not going to be the best situation. The student won't be able to get any federal student aid other than an unsubsidized loan. Even that isn't guaranteed. It's really, the decision is up to the financial aid office at the college. So we do recommend that the student reach out to the financial aid office if they're in this situation, just to explain what's going on with their parental refusal. But likely the outcome is not going to be great unless they can convince the parent to come around and actually complete the FAFSA. And then a separate circumstance is, what if a student has parents who are undocumented and don't have a social security number? Well, the good thing is that the parental citizenship status does not affect a student's aid eligibility at all. In fact, the FAFSA is not going to even ask about the parent's citizenship status. The FAFSA is only going to ask about the student's citizenship status. So if a parent doesn't have a social security number, when you get to the parent demographics section, you're going to enter all zeros for the parent's social security number. Do not use the I-10 or the individual taxpayer identification number. So this is a number that an undocumented parent might have. It's issued by the IRS so that individuals are able to comply with tax law, but it is not a replacement for a social security number. So you should not put the I-10 in the field for social security number on the FAFSA. What you should do instead is put all zeros, and then because they can't create an FSA ID, at the very end of the FAFSA, when they go to sign and submit, they're going to have to print and mail in the signature page rather than signing electronically. So here's a screenshot when you're in the parent demographics. If you're working with a student who is a US citizen, their parents are undocumented, you're going to put all zeros for the social security number. If you are supporting families who include parents with undocumented status, please refer those folks to us, because those situations should be handled with extra care, especially because the parent might have quite complicated tax information. So the parent financials section might become a little trickier with an undocumented parent. So just a recap of what I would recommend when you're trying to figure out how to start an application. First, I would recommend determine whether the student is dependent or independent, and I would use that questionnaire as a screening tool. If the student is dependent, then I would determine who is the parent for FAFSA purposes, and you'll use that flow chart to do that. Now, if the student's a dependent and they should be providing parent information, but they're encountering difficulty, that's when we want to look at the special circumstances to see if any of those apply to our student. And then as a reminder, a parent claiming a student on their federal income taxes is completely irrelevant to dependency and parent determination on the FAFSA. So two totally separate things. So we're going to do a couple scenarios now. So scenario one, Carson's parents are legally separated. She lives with her mother during the weekdays and lives with her father on the weekends. Carson's father claimed her on his 2021 taxes. And Carson is considered a dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA. Whose information should Carson report on the FAFSA? All right, so hopefully you've had some time to think this through. So let's get on to our answer. So Carson should report her mother's information on the FAFSA since she lives with her mother more than her father over the past 12 months. Again, it does not matter that Carson's father claimed Carson on his 2021 tax return. Tax dependency is completely separate from FAFSA dependency. But if Carson's mother ever gets remarried, then Carson will also be reporting the step parents' information on the FAFSA. So let's just see how this looks on the flowchart together. So the parents are legally separated and they don't live together. But when we get to this question, did Carson live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? Assuming Carson spent 5 days of the week with the mother, 2 days of the week with the father, then Carson will answer, yes, I spent more time with my mother, so I'm going to report my mother. And if my mother's remarried, then also my step parent information. It's important to note with this scenario that Carson would answer no to this question here, since Carson's parents are legally separated. So if they're divorced or legally separated, they're not considered married. Scenario two, Maxie hasn't lived with her parents since 2015. She lives with her grandmother, who is her legal guardian and who has not adopted her. Whose information should she report on the FAFSA? So Maxie doesn't actually have to report anyone's information except her own, because Maxie is considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. And that is because Maxie can answer yes to the dependency question about legal guardianship. So we look at all of our dependency questions. We see that there's one that asks, has it been decided by a court in your state of legal residence that someone other than your parent has legal guardianship of you? In this case, yes, Maxie's grandmother has legal guardianship. So Maxie is considered an independent student, meaning no parent information. And just to reiterate, the following people, most of these relatives, are not considered your parent unless they have legally adopted you. So a legal guardian has not legally adopted you, so the legal guardian is not considered your parent. That's why Maxie's independent. All right, last scenario. Toby's parents divorced when he was 5. His mother remarried, and Toby lived with her and his stepfather, who did not adopt him. His mother died last year, but his father is still living. So his biological father is still living. Toby doesn't meet any of the independence criteria. He is a dependent student. Whose information should he report on the FAFSA? So he was living with his mother and his stepfather, but his mother died. And he does not live with his biological father, who's still living. Yeah, this is a little bit of a weird one, but since Toby's biological father is technically his only parent, then Toby needs to report his father's information on the FAFSA, even though Toby is living with and being supported by the stepfather. So I'll show you why this is a bit of a weird one, because it's not quite as straightforward on the flow chart. When you ask, are your parents married to each other? So you're thinking of the biological parents. No, they're not. Do the biological parents live together? No. Now, did you live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? Actually, no. Toby lived with kind of neither over the last 12 months in a bit of a weird way. Perhaps he lived with his mother more over the past 12 months before she passed. But after she passes, she's no longer considered a parent for the purpose of the FAFSA. And then it asks to report the information for the parent who provided more financial support. We would not be considering the stepfather a parent because, as we can see right here, widowed step parents aren't your parent for the FAFSA unless they've legally adopted you. And Toby's stepfather had not legally adopted him. So technically that stepfather is not a parent for FAFSA purposes. So in this case, Toby's going to have to report his biological father's information on the FAFSA, which is really unfortunate. Something that happens often with the students we support is that they're having to report information for someone who honestly has no role in their life. It's just another example of the way that the FAFSA is not reflective of students' actual situations. So I see a question in the chat. What would be the case if the living parent is estranged, not in contact with the child? Exactly, that's often the situation. Often, perhaps the student has no contact with the biological father at all. The FAFSA still expects them to report that parent. Now, what I would encourage the student to do is reach out to the financial aid office of their college, explain the situation. And there's a lot more leniency or what's called professional judgment to take into account all of those situations. So the student might perhaps have a special circumstance where they don't have any contact with that biological father, and so they might get a dependency override in that case. So in cases where it doesn't seem like it's serving the student well at all, always contact the financial aid office to hopefully be supportive of that. So we have covered demographics and dependency. Now we're going to move on to financial information. So for the dependent student, they will need to provide the financial information for their parent or parents, and the parent can use the IRS data retrieval tool. So this is how they can import tax information directly from the IRS. And if they can use this tool, we highly recommend it. It's going to save you time, effort, and then also any follow-up that you might have to do with the college. So the IRS data retrieval tool, it allows users to securely and accurately transfer tax information. The way that you pull this information through is you take the address information that is seen on the tax return. So for this year, the 2021 tax return, and you enter that address information into the tool that will pull through all of your tax information directly into the FAFSA. And then if you are able to do that successfully, then your actual tax information isn't going to show up on the FAFSA. So you're not going to see all those numbers imported. What you're going to see instead is transferred from the IRS. And that is just going to show that it's successfully pulled through. But for the user's protection, it's not actually showing all those details. Unfortunately, not everyone can use this tool. So the following people are ineligible to use the DRT, and instead they're going to have to manually enter their information. So this is students or parents who are married and filed as married filing separately. are married and filed as head of household, or if they filed a Puerto Rican, a foreign tax return, an amended return, so Form 1040X, or a Form 1040-NR. Any of those people wouldn't be able to use the DRT. They're going to have to enter in the information manually. Now, a few tricky situations when it comes to the marital status of the parents and their financial information. So what if the marital status changes after the family has already filed taxes? So definitely something that you might encounter. So say since the 2023-24 FAFSA is referencing 2021 taxes, say that the parent got either married or divorced in 2022. In that case, their marital status might not reflect what their filing status was on their 2021 taxes. So two different scenarios that you could foresee. If your parents filed a joint tax return for 2021, but now they're no longer married when you fill out the FAFSA form, what you'll need to do is subtract the tax return information for your parent's former spouse so that you can correctly answer the FAFSA questions only about the parent whose information you're providing on the FAFSA. So that's if your parents were married but are no longer. And then if your parents didn't file a joint tax return for 2021, but now they are married when you fill out the FAFSA form, you'll need to add the 2021 tax return information for the parent's current spouse in order to correctly answer the questions on the FAFSA. So that way you're accounting for your parent and their current spouse, which wouldn't have been reflected on the 2021 taxes. So if you're in this situation, I recommend reaching out to our help desk or the Federal Student Aid Hotline just to make sure you're able to account for all of that correctly in the financial section. All right, so our very last section is where you sign and submit the FAFSA. For dependent students, both the parent and the student will need to sign the FAFSA. So you see here, both signatures are needed. There are multiple ways to provide those. Signing electronically will result in the fastest processing, but we know that option isn't available to everyone. So for independent students, they're really just going to have to only worry about their own signature. And in that case, they should be using their FSA ID to sign electronically. For dependent students, because both the student and parent will sign, they should both sign electronically if that's possible. But if the parent doesn't have a social security number and because of that can't create an FSA ID, that's when the parent will print off the signature page, sign it, and mail it to the address listed. So here's what it looks like when you're not signing electronically with the FSA ID. What you'll do instead is you'll print that signature page. And then like we showed you earlier in the webinar, you'll have that pop up where the page comes up that you print out and sign. It is really important that the student, not just if the student's in this situation where their parents having to print and mail the signature page, that they not just do like their own student signature and then press submit without the parent signature. They're gonna get communications about it not being complete. They'll have to have that signature page get mailed in for their FAFSA to be fully processed. So speaking of like kind of the difference between submission and completion, because just because a student submitted their FAFSA does not actually mean it is complete. So we want to make that distinction here. Submitted applications reflect all FAFSA forms that were just submitted by students. So as long as the student clicked that submit button, then it will show up. However, these applications can then be rejected by the US Department of Education. And that's usually because there's some key pieces of information missing. Any application that isn't rejected is going to be considered a complete application. So completed applications are a subset of submitted applications. I might have had 100 seniors at my school submit their application, and I might only have 60 that are considered complete. So if a FAFSA form is submitted but not complete, the student should receive communication from the US Department of Education. They'll likely also receive an email from the Alabama Commission on Higher Education. But a completed FAFSA form is what is necessary to determine eligibility for federal student aid and often other forms of aid. So you do want to make sure that the student gets all the way from submission to completion. And you're able to track that. You're going to track individual student FAFSA progress by using the AIC portal, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But common reasons that a submitted FAFSA might not be fully complete is if it has missing information or invalid information. I would say most commonly if it's missing signatures. So again, that student could sign with their FSA ID, not do the parent signature, and then press submit, and it would be submitted, but it would not be complete. And then there are a bunch of other rejection codes that are a possibility. These would be noted in the student aid report, and it would also be noted in email communications from AIC. So hopefully that provides a little clarity, although there are several reasons why a submitted FAFSA might not be complete. So it is very much dependent on the student's situation. So let's just take a quick look at some resources like the data platforms that I just mentioned. But before I get to that, I want to just promote the FAFSA demo system. This is where you can practice a bunch of different FAFSA scenarios. So it's kind of a live demonstration system where you can access the 2023-24 FAFSA. So it's going to have all the same features, but the only difference being you're not actually processing any data when you're using it. So you can either use this on your own just to get comfortable, or if you are leading a big group FAFSA workshop, you can log into the FAFSA using the demo system, and that way you're able to maybe project on your screen each step of the process so that students can look up on the screen and follow along as they're doing their real application. So highly recommend that. In terms of tracking FAFSA completion at your school, you can use our dashboard. It's the Cash for College dashboard, and that's available at alabamapossible.org/dashboard. So this is going to show you school-wide data. We update it every single week from the month of October through June. So we're currently showing data through October 28th. And this is something you can definitely use while we're waiting for the AIC portal to get updated. One thing that's very important to know, and I know it's a frustrating feature of this, but for public schools, we're currently using last year's 12th grade enrollment numbers. And that's because the State Department of Education has not released this year's 12th grade enrollment numbers. They usually do that around the month of November. As soon as they do it, we will put the fresh enrollment figures into our dashboard. But for right now, it's showing last year's enrollment numbers. So FAFSA completion is a bit of a proxy, but at least it's something you can reference until the AIC portal gets going. The AIC portal, if you've never heard of it, it's the Alabama Commission on Higher Education's FAFSA completion progress, and this allows you to view the progress of your individual students. So what you'll need is some login credentials, and once you have those login credentials, you'll be able to search individual students. So it's especially useful. They currently are estimating that it will be updated around November 22nd for the current FAFSA cycle. So highly recommend if you don't have credentials already that you get those. You can do that by emailing fafsa@aic.edu. I'm going to type that in the chat. And we're also going to be covering both of these platforms in great detail in a future webinar. So we'll send out information for that in our newsletter. If you're completely new to the AIC portal, we have created a guide. I think it's 4 or 5 pages. It's pretty comprehensive and includes some frequently asked questions, as well as how to get your students' information correct in PowerSchool so that your students' information is pulling into the FAFSA portal. So we want to spend some time talking about this just so that all of your FAFSA monitoring goes as smoothly as possible this year. And a big component of that is getting information correct in PowerSchool. So we have a guest with us today, Quandria from PowerSchool, one of the coaches, who's going to take some time and show you what you should set up in PowerSchool to get this all running smoothly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Quandria.
Thank you so much, May and Alabama Possible, for inviting me out. I am Quandria Robinson, one of the state's PowerSchool coaches. So I'm really excited about being here on today. I really appreciate, as a former school counselor, what May and Alabama Possible are doing for our students across the state. Every year, thousands of our students across the state, they are leaving millions and millions of dollars on the table by not completing those FAFSAs. So we want to make sure that our students are completing these FAFSAs. So what I'll be doing today is just providing some information on what we should look to put inside of PowerSchool. So when we do access the Alabama Higher Education website to put in those waivers, that our student information is correct so we can get good information when it comes to reporting. So as I mentioned before, I'm Quandria Robinson, and as a PowerSchool coach, I service primarily regions 4 through 7, but I am available to go across the state. We have 2 other PowerSchool coaches across the state. We have Jessica Board, and she serves regions 8 through 11, which is in South Alabama. And then we have Kendall Tankersley. She serves in regions 1 through 3, which is in North Alabama. So what I'll do, I'll break this presentation down. It should take me maybe 7 minutes to go over this information. And then we'll use the last part, that last free time that I have, and we'll take any questions that you all may have. So the first thing we want to look at, we want to make sure that we don't have any errors in PowerSchool when it comes to student demographics. And of course, that covers student names, birthdays, even their graduation cohorts. We want to make sure that information is correct. So when a student enters our school or enters our district, we want to make sure this information is correct. One error we've seen, a student may have a nickname, and we may call that student that nickname, but we want to make sure when inputting information in PowerSchool, we're using that student's legal name, that name that is listed on their birth certificate or social security card. So make sure when you're on this demographics page that you enter that full legal name. Also with addresses and phone numbers, we know that is important information, but we know we do have populations of our students across the state. They may be transient, so their addresses and phone numbers may change on a regular basis. But I will show you in just a minute one way that not just you, because if we had to sit every day and update student contact information, that's all we would do all day. So I'll show you in just a minute a way that parents and students can do that in PowerSchool. All right. Now, another thing that causes a lot of errors when it comes to the higher education portal is some of our students may be provisionally enrolled in our schools or in our districts. So from your start page in PowerSchool, you will notice here on the left-hand side, you have a provisional enrollment hyperlink. And with that hyperlink, it will give you a list of students. If you select that hyperlink, it'll give you a list of students that are provisionally enrolled on your campus. And our goal throughout the school year is to have no students listed on this list, because what that means is they may be physically at your school, but PowerSchool is showing some type of error between the school that they recently left and your school. And some of those errors can be very simple, and they can be simple to resolve. For example, you may be familiar with the term E99. So if you have a student that's listed as an E99, pretty much what that means is the transfer process that started or was supposed to start at the losing school, it wasn't completed properly. Okay. Also, what may have happened is the entry and exit dates that you or the losing school used, they may not have been correct. For example, that student may have transferred from your campus on last Friday, but the new school is saying that they were enrolled the day before, and that's not possible. So we have to make sure that our exit dates and entry dates do not overlap when we have our students, whether they transfer or enroll with us. Okay, so make sure that your provisional enrollment page is clear and that you don't have any students that are listed there. Okay, now I do have a report that you could run, and this is a plugin. Okay, plugins, I like to compare them to apps, and a lot of us have apps on our phones, and apps make our phones better. Okay, so this is the plugin. It's called the PSCB Custom Report Bundle. And if you contact your district office, the person that handles Power School or your tech director, they will know where to find this plugin and how to download this plugin so teachers and staff across your district will be able to use it. So with the PSCB Custom Report Bundle, not only do we have enrollment reports, but we also have attendance reports. You can run homeroom reports, honor roll reports. This is the perfect bundle of reports for anyone, especially if you are a school counselor, registrar, if you're the attendance clerk. It's a lot of information here. So this is the PSCB Custom Report Bundle. We selected the enrollment tab once we select the PSCB Custom Report. And at the bottom there, you would see school transfers for the current year. So if you select that school transfers for the current year, this is the report. And I just want to make note that we do have some students listed here, but these are not real students. This is not real student data. This is from my sandbox that I use. But notice here, I have 2 students, and I know in a real school, you may have several students that have come and gone over the school year. So I have 2 students here. It gives me their grade, the actual school, the entry codes, the exit codes, the exit dates. So this lets me know the students that transferred during the year. So you can actually print this report, and notice here, you can export this data. You can make it a CSV if you want to export it, but it gives you an idea to make sure that you're cleaning up your Power School. You don't want kids that have transferred out to still show that they're active at your school. So this is a great report that you could use, okay? Now, another great way to make sure that you don't have any errors, and it's called Level Data Apps. And if you go to your start page in your Power School, and you would go all the way down to the left-hand corner, and it says State Validation. And if you select that State Validation hyperlink there, you will have several tabs that will appear. So pretty much what these tabs are doing, they're showing you any errors that you have in Power School. Now, all of these tabs are important, but for this presentation where we're talking about seniors, making sure they have all their information is correct, we want to take a look at the enrollment tab, because what that enrollment tab is going to do, it'll let us know if any of our students, if their demographic information is incorrect, if their cohort information is incorrect. And notice here, we have a validation rule. So it tells us the rule that we have broken. And it also gives us an option to fix that error. Okay, so for example, here on the screen, I have contacts with no associated students. That's the rule that I wrote. And I have 65 of those errors. So if I wanted to fix those 65 errors, I could select list. It will show me those 65 contacts. I could select each one of those contacts and I can actually associate those contacts with students if that's what I wanted to fix at that point in time. Okay, so make sure that the information on that enrollment tab is going to be correct. Okay, federal programs, if you have any students that receive any special services, if you click that tab, you'll be able to fix those errors. So it's very important that we keep these tabs clear. And I know with contacts, like I said earlier, some students, those phone numbers, they change every other week. So I'm not going to say that contacts is not important, but the most important tabs will be your enrollment, your demographics, your federal programs, but contacts is not as important. It's important, but it's not as important as those other tabs, okay? Now, one way that our students or our parents can update any contact information, they can actually access the parent portal or student portal for PowerSchool. And this information is usually given out at the beginning of the year. Some districts send out district letters. And with those letters, parents have the access code, access IDs where they can go in, view student grades. They can also look at historical grades. They can look at any test scores, if test scores are uploaded, teacher comments. Now, keep in mind, not every parent portal or student portal will look like this, but all of them in general have the same information where you have grades. Attendance is a big thing. Parents can go in and look at their students' daily, weekly, monthly attendance, okay? So I do understand across the state, we have some districts that may use registration software like InfoSnap or PowerSchool enrollment. That will be the same, they would use that same software to update demographics. Okay, so if they don't have access to the parent portal or student portal, and you all use, InfoSnap or PowerSchool enrollment, one of those third-party softwares, they can also log in to update information that way. Okay. All right, now another very important page. This is the Alabama State Province page, and it's so much information on this page. And when it comes to reporting, a lot of this information goes directly to our State Department. The State Department, of course, shares this information with the U.S. Department of Education. If you have students that are doing career tech, we can mark if they are CTE completers. If they meet that work keys benchmark, we can list student graduation type, the graduation exit date. But the most important thing here, in the case of this webinar that we're doing, we can list the waiver types for students who complete or don't complete that FAFSA. If they have a waiver, we can list it here on this page here, okay? So this is an example. This is my student I like to use. This is Mickey. So with Mickey, he has a district waiver. And his waiver, notice here I can put the waiver completion date. And I can also attach the waiver if I wanted to. That's an option. And that's pretty much, up to your discretion, or if your district wants to upload the actual waivers. I've seen some counselors, they may actually keep the actual real waiver, maybe in a folder or something in their office, but you do have the option to attach that waiver if you like. Now, let's say, for example, because with this Alabama State Province page, you can only view one student page at a time. So if you have a student, 12th grade student class, that's 200 or 300 students, it will take you all day to mark those waiver types. So there is a way that we can mark those waiver types in mass. If you were to go to a page, you would have, let me just go back here, you would have 3 different options. Most PowerSchool systems are set up with 3 different options. And I'll show you those 3 waiver type options in just a minute. But what you would do, you would select those students first, okay? So notice here, I selected 206 of my 12th grade students. Once I select those students, I want to use my group functions, and your group functions will be that upside down white triangle. Okay. Once I select my group functions, I want to make sure that I select under functions, student field value. Okay. So once I select student field value, it takes me to this dialog box here. Now I have a field to change, and notice fields is a blue hyperlink. So once I select fields, it takes me to a large screen where I have maybe 400, 500, 600 different field value options. But the option that I want, I listed it here. This is a waiver type. And then notice here, my next box, I have new field value. Okay. Another important message on this screen, it says warning, this change is irreversible. So we want to make sure that we do have the correct students listed and that we are putting in the correct field value. So this is how we determine our field value. Notice here, under waiver type, there are 3 different options. So we have no waiver, which would be number 1, parent waiver, that's number 2, district waiver is number 3. Okay, so let's go back. So with our 206 students, if we wanted to do the entire class, or if we wanted to select 50 students or 20 students, however many students, and we want them to all have district waivers. So notice here on our page, district waiver will be number 3. So for our new field value, we want to put number 3 there, because what that's going to do for all of the students that we selected, the number 3 option, which is district waiver, will be selected for all of those students. Okay, so we place our number 3 there and we select submit. Okay, so once we select submit, all of those students that we selected, their waiver type will now be district waiver, which is option 3. Okay. Now, that is the end of our presentation. I want to open our chat box up to any questions. Before I go, I wanted to advise you all that we do have some upcoming Power School professional development. This is a session that will be held at the University of Alabama. It's a 2-day session. You're not required to attend both days, but the days for the training will be January 12th and 13th. And you can also register for this session using the Power School Professional Learning website. Now, for additional information on having any of our coaches come out to your schools, we do come to schools, we go to districts. This is our contact QR code. And also I attached a survey QR code that you all could use. And I'll use this screen. And May, if you could, do you see any questions in our chat while we're
I don't see any questions, but I had one. Since you mentioned that that action was irreversible, does
mhm.
that mean that the counselor would not be able to go back to an individual student's profile and update that?
Yes, she could go back individually. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
just the bulk action is done.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Someone asked if these slides could be shared in our follow-up email. Is that possible?
I can. Did you want me to? I can share it with you.
Perfect. That would be great. I'll pass it along.
Okay. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for the information, Quandria. Just to reiterate to everyone, the reason this is so important is because a student's basic information, as well as any transfer dates, if applicable, is going to be so important to have accurate so that all of the student information is pulling into the AIC portal where you're able to monitor FAFSA completion. So I hope this information helped everyone. So for high school educators who want the PD credit, they'll need to visit the Power School link you see on the screen, and then you'll need to enter in course number 295-839, section number 458-874. And we will include this in the follow-up email so that you're able to see that information there. So next week, we're going to have our Cash for College Scholarships 101 webinar. Really important for a few reasons related to our content today. This is going to be a good way to learn about supplementing federal aid through the form of scholarships. And it's also going to be an opportunity to learn about scholarships for immigrant students who often don't have access to federal aid through the FAFSA. So we'll be talking about that as well as highlighting some Alabama specific scholarships on that webinar. Next week, we'll also have our first FAFSA office hours. That will be for educators and then representatives from community-based organizations. So it's a come and go style meeting where you'll just hop on Zoom between 2 and 3:30, whenever's convenient for you. And you'll bring specific questions you have. So especially if you have any of the complicated scenarios we talked about today, feel free to bring them to that session. And then lastly, we're going to have our next community building conversation on November 29th at noon. That will be led by our members of our Educator Advisory Council. And so once registration is available, we'll be promoting that in our newsletter. Just want to do a quick reminder, this was also in our newsletter this morning, but a reminder of our Best Hustle Award, which has a December 1st deadline. This award is given to schools with at least 10% improvement in early FAFSA completion. So when we're comparing early completion in 2021 to early completion in 2022, so right now, and we're defining early completion as completion during the months of October and November. So you have until December 1st to really hone in on FAFSA completion with your students, and the winners of that award will be announced around December 14th. A quick reminder that you do have to be registered for the Alabama Goes to College campaign in order to receive this recognition. Also, just want to quickly plug our FAFSA walkthrough. So this is a step-by-step video that is created specifically for Alabama high school seniors who are considered dependent students on the FAFSA. And you can either watch it in its entirety, or you can click through the different chapters on the YouTube video. So you can click just individual sections from logging in all the way to signing and submitting. So that is available. If you'd like to send students our way, we can answer any FAFSA questions through our help desk. They can text or call us at 334-316-6155. And then you as educators are also welcome to call that line. These are some resources available to y'all, of course, through federal student aid. We have FAFSA.gov and the financial aid toolkit. We also have that hotline, and the reason that I plug this is because sometimes FAFSA issues are only able to be resolved through this hotline. So I know the hold time might be frustrating, but for many of y'all who've called our help desk, I have assisted you by facilitating conversations with the federal student aid hotline. And the representatives are always really great. It just might require a little bit of a hold time, but there are some instances, and we've already had several crop up this year, where only the hotline would be able to resolve the issue. So that's why I plug it. In terms of our resources, we have our Cash for College toolkit available. So it has all kinds of one-pagers. It has printable assets, including some of the ones that you saw on our slides today. So like the dependency questionnaire, the who's my parent flowchart, all of that good information is available in the toolkit. So I believe that is all. What I can do is just reiterate some answers to some of the questions in the chat. So the first was that students were having problems with their phone number already being in use. So yes, that's definitely something that could crop up. We sent out some information about that in last week's newsletter, so I'm just gonna read it out. Basically, this will need to be resolved with federal student aid, so that hotline I was telling you about. But there's a couple different things that could happen. So one, it could be that the number is already linked to another account, but the cell phone is unverified on the other account. If that's the case, federal student aid is able to immediately remove it and link it to the correct person. So that would be kind of the easiest step. If the cell phone is verified and tied to another account, but it hasn't been used in the past 14 months, then federal student aid can again unlink that number and add it to the correct student's account. The problem is when the phone number is verified and it has actually been used in the past 14 months. In that case, federal student aid is not able to unlink it. They'd have to wait for that 14 months of inactive use to be able to link the number to their account. But this shouldn't ultimately cause problems for the student because the student is able to simply use an email address to verify rather than having to provide a phone number. So they're still able to use multi-factor authentication. They'll just use the email option instead of the phone option. I believe that might be all. All of our other FAFSA related webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So I'll put a link to that in the follow-up email as well. Thank you so much for sticking around for so long. We really appreciate y'all's investment in students and your support of their FAFSA completion. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your day.